Many thanks to Roger Hions and welcome to Olivia Plender, our
Thank
next
you.
speaker. Welcome. Shall I start? Actually, Olivia, one first question I wanted to ask is a question we also asked Roger. I was somehow wondering the sort of generational question which we thought could be interesting in terms of the 90s being in England so much marked by YBA. We were somehow wondering your work having clearly started in this sort of new decade, and maybe can actually come up during this marathon with a kind of a name for the decade at a certain moment, which maybe could be interesting, because it's very weird. The decade ends soon, it's ending, it still doesn't have a name. But we were somehow wondering if you felt that there was a rupture or not, or how sort of the 90s would relate to this new decade, and to which extent you would feel part of a new generation.
I was actually hoping you weren't going to ask me that question when I heard you asking it to Roger. But in terms of the 90s, trying to sort of cast my mind back, I have to say I extremely disliked the YBA movement. And I felt extremely unhappy in London at the end of the 90s when all that stuff was really coming to a head, because it didn't feel like it was attached to anything that I was particularly interested in. And it didn't feel like it was creating a landscape that I wanted to be a part of in London, as in a cultural landscape. So in that sense, I think there has been some kind of rupture. But I wouldn't like to name what that is. I don't think I'd like to kind of place, sort of give it any kind of name. Because much as sort of I find Roger's work interesting, I wouldn't particularly associate it with mine. And I think there's a lot of, London is such a kind of huge art scene. There's a lot of different art scenes within it. So you get kind of different, different sort of, wouldn't like to use the word movements, but sort of, for want of a better word, different movements happening within London that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And some of the artists who are sort of very active in London at the moment wouldn't necessarily participate in this kind of event. So I think you can't put one title on the sort of whatever it is that's happened post the 90s.
Can you maybe tell us about some of the research you're doing right now in relation to London? Because when we spoke recently, you mentioned your kind of interest in this sort of counterculture kind of organization, mainly esoteric organization. And it's very interesting that they actually, in big parts, started very near the Serpentine Gallery in Kensington and in this neighborhood. And actually, we discussed last time when we spoke that the sort of Science Museum and these sort of esoteric organizations sort of originated from the same kind of initiator. So I was curious how this research stands right now, because I think in terms of mapping London, it's a kind of a very interesting project.
Well, it sort of starts with, the stuff I've been looking at is non-conformist religious movements and how they overlap with kind of social protest movements, basically. And in a way, it actually started in the north of England, because I was up in the Lake District and up in Dundee after that. And specifically two religious movements I'm looking at. One is the modern spiritualist movement, which started in New York State in 1848, and is a religion based on speaking to the dead, where the medium replaces the role of the priest, and kind of mediates between the congregation and spirit, which is sort of the equivalent, the non-denominational equivalent to God, or the sort of non-gendered, non-specific equivalent to God. But it became very big in the north of England amongst non-conformist religious communities, like sort of Methodists and Quakers and those sorts of religions, as opposed to establishment churches. And then kind of started in Keighley in Yorkshire, and kind of in about 1850, I think, and then sort of spread south and ended up in London, where in a sense it became more establishment. But Kensington was very much the home of that sort of activity, kind of occult activity. For instance, you have the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, who are in Belgrave Square, in a sort of wonderful old mansion house, which I think was sort of gifted to the movement at that time, but is now kind of slightly decaying. Or you have the Society for Psychical Research, which is a sort of funny organisation that I accidentally joined when I was using their library one time. And now, because they're largely sort of the membership basis is people over the age of 70 who feel that it's very important to discover whether, once and for all, empirically and scientifically, whether there is life after death. But they have trouble sort of getting younger members. So if you're under 50 and you're going to use the library, they'll try and press you into becoming a member quite quickly. But they're based in Kensington as well. And in a funny way, that sort of activity kind of started off, when it was in the north, it was very much about disenfranchised people, kind of people without a public voice, using this very strange circumstance, you know, of sort of claiming to speak to the dead as a way of making political statements in public. So, for instance, you have kind of women at seances in the north of England giving a political speech for kind of 3 hours about how women should have the vote, but it would be kind of channeling the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. So it's not them saying it, it's the ghost of Abraham Lincoln saying that women should have the vote. But as I said, when it got to London, it sort of became much more establishment. So the Society for Psychical Research was sort of set up by Balfour, who I think he was a British Prime Minister in the 19th century, and kind of a lot of Cambridge physicists and people who are very much part of the establishment. And then you have kind of the Theosophical Society, which is around here as well, which was the sort of kind of elitist backlash. Like occultism was sort of a massive movement sweeping Europe and sort of large parts of the world. And kind of Theosophy was a sort of spiritualist sect which re-established hierarchy. Kind of the point of spiritualism was that it was non-hierarchical, and everybody could be on the platform. You know, that sort of. I mean, even today, when you go to a spiritualist church, mediums spend a lot of time kind of telling the congregation, kind of, you know, it's me up here, but any of you could be up here. You know, you just need to do a bit of work on your kind of psychic skills, and you could be up here in a couple of years. But sort of Theosophy was the reverse. Theosophy was about sort of re-establishing the hierarchy, and kind of making all the sort of knowledge secret again, and kind of, you know, you can only attain occult knowledge through special initiations and sort of, you know, Madame Blavatsky at the top or whoever at the top, and kind of, you know, sort of, so it was re-establishing the hierarchy. So in a funny way, kind of Kensington is where sort of non-conformism met the establishment. That's that kind of non-conformism as expressed through occult movements.
What kind of shape do you give this research?
Kind of a bit of everything. It sort of comes out in different directions. At the moment, I'm doing a book about it all, which is a graphic novel. But I do a lot of, sometimes lectures. Sometimes, at the moment, I'm making a radio program as well about it. Sometimes I make installations. Kind of varies. The shape sort of varies, but it's. I've been at it for a few years, so. As I said, it does come out in different directions, in different shapes.
And this idea of kind of different directions, different shapes, has also to do with the incredible sort of variety of different things you're doing at the same time, because you're running and editing a magazine, Untitled. At the same time, you're also doing your kind of self-published publications. You have your obviously practice as an artist, and at the same time, you also sort of venture into sort of more TV-related projects, and that's actually something I was very curious to ask you about, because it's something we have very little explored so far in these conversations of the London Marathon, is the kind of moment of TV. And one of the things, Eric Hobsbawm, when we started to talk to him, he said we should not forget, memory, because he says we should be a marathon of a protest against forgetting. So a lot of kind of moments have come up of the 50s, 60s, 70s, which are for artists or architects or designers a toolbox today. But TV hasn't really come up, yet there have been very interesting sort of TV things going on in England in the 50s and 60s, and as far as I understand, is you revisit certain of those sort of 50s, 60s TV projects, and I was very curious to know if I'm right to assume that this is a toolbox for you, and how you kind of use those things now.
I think so. With the stuff I've done about television, it's mostly about Monitor, which was the first arts programme on British, or the first magazine format arts programme on British TV. And so one of the reasons I'm revisiting that stuff, I suppose, is because the landscape of arts programs on TV have completely changed shape. Like the last sort of decade, television is totally different from what it was when I was young. And I think in the 50s it was much when people were kind of, when television was a new thing and people were trying to work out the formats, they were related to older modes of expression. So a lot of arts programs up until, the 80s really were based on the lecture format. So you had sort of Ways of Seeing, or you had kind of Kenneth Clark's Civilization series, or a lot of the Monitor programs, it was always Hugh Weldon sort of with a slightly paternalistic air, speaking to camera, delivering a lecture about, whatever the subject would be. But that kind of lecture format has completely disappeared from TV. And it's kind of a mixed blessing. I mean, I don't watch television, and I think it might be a crass generalisation, but I think quite a lot of people in the art world and a lot of people I know don't watch television anymore. And I think television sort of has ceased to provide what it did. It ceased to provide much educational content, which is something that it very much did for, which maybe stopped with my generation of artists, and that you'd sort of, when I was a teenager, you watched TV, you might stumble across a Fellini film at 2 a.m, you didn't know what it was, but it was kind of incredible, and it was part of the world you wanted to inhabit, but you had no idea where that was, and art school seemed like the place to kind of go to, attach yourself to that.
And you revisit these moments, and how does this work? Is it a project? Can you tell us more about this TV project, how it will...
Well, I guess it's a couple of things I've done. Like one was an interview that I did with Ken Russell, the British filmmaker, who worked for the Monitor programme for about a decade, and he made documentaries about artists from everyone from kind of romantic poets, like Shelley, kind of Keats, Coleridge, Wordsworth, all those sort of people, to he made a very well-known documentary called Pop Goes the Easel, which was about the Royal College of Art and the kind of young pop artists. So I spent about a year trying to track down Ken, and then met him in a village hall in the Lake District in front of an audience which was the local cinema club. And because he used to live in the Lake District and kind of, it's the home of British romanticism, and kind of a lot of the people in the audience had kind of either been extras in his films or had some contact with him, or sort of seen him in the supermarket in 1982 or something. So that felt like a kind of appropriate audience to invite. And then I built a set which looked like a television studio and sort of interviewed him in the style of a television interview circa 1972. So very much in the kind of old format, like now on TV you don't get kind of so much of that. Like a TV interview would not be an hour long. It would probably be more like this, in fact, kind of, where each of us, I think, gets about 25 minutes. So it's in a sense, I think this sort of situation is, this leads on to something that I'd quite like to do, which is to ask you two a couple of questions about the situation we're in now, because I'm quite curious about how you arrived at this format and the idea of the 24-hour interview, and sort of and kind of what the purpose is in a way. Because it's an interesting project to embark on, but do you see this as research or or is it a performance, or kind of how do you see this process yourselves?
It's not really a performance, at least not for me, but it's kind of an articulation of a curiosity about London and about the simultaneous existence of so many ways of thinking in one particular city at the moment that it is kind of really confronted with many of its own contradictions, seemingly on its way to become radically different from what it used to be, etc., etc. So it's really an inventory.
And it's also a continuation of kind of many kind of interviews, Rem and I have recorded together, and it's sort of mainly the continuation
Some
of a project.
Some of them very long.
Very long, actually, in Japan. It's a continuation of a kind of a marathon we did in Tokyo, where we sort of tried to map a movement. The idea was to look for a movement which was still from the 60s. It was all about this idea of a movement with a manifesto, and we found actually after a longer research that the metabolist movement could be a really interesting movement to make that sort of portrait, because all the protagonists are still active. At the same time, also there is a kind of a big interest in metabolism right now of many younger artists and architects. So the idea was sort of how to do this portrait, and obviously we interviewed everybody, not just the architects, but all the other participants, the critics, the engineers, the
politicians.
The politicians, very important, and sort of that sort of took 3 days, and then at a certain moment when we started thinking about the program in London, the idea would be to do this. And we started out actually with the idea that the interviews would be 45 minutes to maybe 1 hour, but then, I mean, the process developed into a dynamic, and there were just, many different practitioners from different fields we wanted to talk to, and then little by little, that's how it evolved. So it didn't really have a master plan at the beginning, it very much sort of developed out of a dynamic. But thank you very much, Olivia, thank you.